30 years ago, a newspaper landed on nearly every driveway in America before sunrise, thudding softly against the concrete. Today, most of those driveways sit empty. Circulation collapsed, newsrooms shuttered. Printing presses that once hummed through the night now sit silent. It wasn't because people stopped wanting news. The economics that sustained newspapers for a century slowly unraveled. This is how newspapers rose, and why the system that carried them forward could no longer survive. For most of the 20th century, newspapers were infrastructure. Every morning and often every evening, families across towns and cities picked up their paper to learn what had happened in their world and their community the day before. Newspapers carried a mix of information people couldn't get anywhere else, like the latest political developments, international events, local councils' decisions, obituaries, sports scores, weather forecasts, job listings, and community notices. In many places, there were separate morning and evening editions, each with its own audience and rhythm tied to daily life and work schedules. Morning editions reached door stands before work, and evening editions reached commuters on their way home. Before 24/7 broadcast news and the internet, newspapers were the primary information network. They documented local events, connected readers to national discourse, and shaped civic conversations. Households arranged their day around them, sharing sections at the breakfast table and clipping pages for reference. Without newspapers, there was no way to know what the government was doing and what was happening in the wider world. But there was one thing that made newspapers such a financial success in the 20th century. And ironically, that's also what caused them to disappear in the internet age. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you're enjoying this content so far, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch these videos without subscribing. Imagine what we could accomplish if everyone subscribed. We all thank you for your continued support. The business of newspapers was built on a surprisingly simple economic logic. Ads paid for the news. People did pay for subscriptions and bought single copies at newsstands, and those sales covered the basic costs of printing and delivering the paper. But it was advertising, especially classifieds, that generated real profits. Classified ads were small, text-based listings for jobs, cars, apartments, and services that filled pages and were sold at high margins because every local business employer and every individual looking to sell or buy something had no choice but to place their notices in the local paper. In many markets, these classifieds accounted for a huge share of total revenue, and that subsidized the newsroom and the rest of the operation. Newspapers could charge robust rates for this space because the paper was the only way they could reach a large, geographically concentrated audience. The economic model was so profitable that industry insiders called classifieds in newspapers rivers of gold. Many companies invested heavily in securing that revenue stream long before the internet emerged. Editors and accountants alike balanced subscription income against their advertising income to fund expansion, staff salaries, and investigative reporting. Display ads from larger companies also supplemented this, but it was the volume and consistency of classifieds that made the newspaper business attractive, reliable, and extremely profitable for decades. Things began to change with the emergence of the internet, but this wasn't enough to collapse this business empire in an instant. The internet. The internet didn't kill newspapers overnight. In the early 1990s and 2000s, as the World Wide Web became widely accessible, many newspapers started putting their print stories online for free, hoping that digital advertising would eventually make up for the sudden loss of print ad revenue. Publishers assumed they could build massive online audiences and attract ad dollars the same way they once did on paper. But that strategy didn't work out the way they expected. Digital ad rates were far lower than print, and the revenue from online ads never came close to offsetting the collapse of print advertising that followed. Display and classified ads were once the dominant source of profit for newspapers moved to the web in forms that were cheaper and more efficient for advertisers, leaving newspapers with far less income to sustain their operations. As people started to access the news through their mobile devices and computers, readership shifted online. This reduced the demand for physical papers and started to reduce the lucrative print ad base. Compared with print, Digital platforms like search engines and social networks offered advertisers better targeting and immediate engagement. Even better, it was way cheaper than a newspaper ad. The result? Although newspapers could generate some online ad revenue, it was only a fraction of what they had lost in print. But there was one turning point as newspapers disappeared, and that was online marketplaces. Newspaper classified ads were one of the most profitable revenue streams, often making up a huge share of total ad income. But that all changed with the arrival of online marketplaces that offered the same service without charging people to post. Craigslist, which started in the mid-1990s and spread nationwide by the 2000s, quickly became the go-to place for job listings, apartments, and car sales because it was free and easier to use than paying for a classified spot in a paper. When that happened, newspapers that once depended on fees from classified listings saw those dollars vanish almost overnight as advertisers moved online, forcing many publications to cut prices, raise subscription costs, and reduce staff in response to revenue loss. In some markets, newspapers lost about 40% of their classified income. And around the same time, Craigslist alone cost the industry billions in ad revenue during the early 2000s. As long as someone had an internet connection, they could access free, searchable digital ads anywhere they were. The disappearance of print ads changed reader expectations about where and how to find information on local goods and services. Once users got used to free online classifieds, there was no motivation to return to the old paid model. That's how the newspaper business model became obsolete. As the years went on, big advertisers shifted, and digital platforms offered a challenge that newspapers couldn't compete with. For decades after newspapers spread in the 20th century, larger advertisers followed one rule, which was to place ads where the largest local audiences were concentrated, and that was in the daily paper. Supermarkets, car dealerships, and national brands all bought space in the biggest advertisers, while local businesses picked small slots in the smaller newspapers. But as the internet matured, big advertisers started to shift their budgets toward digital platforms that promised something newspapers could never match: precise data, real-time tracking, and massive scale. Search engines like Google and social networks such as Facebook could tell marketers who exactly was seeing their ads, what actions those users took, and how much return each dollar earned. Traditional newspaper ads, even the online versions, didn't have that level of measurability and targeting. So, companies gradually reduced their spending on print and even on newspaper websites in favor of ads that could be optimized based on demographic, interest, or behavior. The shift wasn't instant, but over time, it became clear that digital ad platforms captured a disproportionate share of marketing budgets, leaving newspapers with a shrinking slice of the pie. Online platforms received a significant portion of all advertising spend, dwarfing what newspapers collect, and making it difficult for them to compete for the attention of advertisers. So, when newspapers could no longer make money from ads, they began to face a big problem, and that was the costs. For newspapers that once filled breakfast tables and newsstands, the cost problem became a defining crisis as the industry's economics collapsed under the weight of the changing readership and expensive production. Printing newspapers involves massive fixed costs, such as printing presses, rolls of newsprint, distribution networks, fleets of delivery vehicles, and the labor to staff them. When circulation numbers were high, those fixed costs could be spread across millions of copies, making each one cheap to produce. But as digital alternatives lured readers away, the print circulation started to shrink dramatically, eroding the scale that once made the physical newspapers cost-effective. In the US, total weekday newspaper circulation has been failing steadily since the 1990s. By 2020, the average daily circulation was less than half of what it was decades earlier. The decline in readers had a direct effect on revenue, but that also meant that the per-copy production costs increased because there were fewer copies over which to share the same infrastructure expenses. In many cases, newspapers responded to the low number of audiences by increasing their subscription prices or cutting editions, and that sped up the loss of readers. In 2009, the San Francisco Chronicle saw circulation plunge by more than 25% in that year, as ad revenues evaporated and print demand dropped. Faced with these pressures and the obligations to maintain presses, newspapers had few options. Cost-cutting became the only way to stay afloat, and that usually meant layoffs and newsroom shrinkage. As the staff numbers fell, there was less capacity for in-depth investigative reporting and broad coverage, so many newspapers were shadows of their former selves. Eventually, they began to close down, and that led to news deserts around the world. Over the past 2 decades, the presence of newspapers has shrunk dramatically as local papers have closed outright, creating news deserts. These are communities with little or no access to professional local journalism. In the United States alone, the number of counties without any local news outlet has climbed into the hundreds, with more than 200 counties entirely lacking a local news source and over 1,500 with only a single outlet as of the latest data. This was the cumulative effect of thousands of newspaper closures. Since 2005, the U.S. has lost roughly 3,300 newspapers, with current trends showing more than 130 newspapers shutting down each year. Many of those shuttered outlets were small, independent papers that once served as the only source of local reporting for their towns. Without them, all the coverage of school boards, city councils, planning commissions, and local elections all but vanished. For the newspapers that survived the collapse of print and advertising, it became necessary to reinvent online. In response to the declining ad revenue and shrinking print circulation, many publications started experimenting with digital paywalls. These are systems that limit how much content a reader can view for free before requiring a subscription. This was a shift from the old ad-supported model to one where subscription revenue helps sustain operations, especially as income from display ads remained weak. Between 2006 and 2022, 17 regional U.S. newspapers adopted paywalls as this transition became more common. This was an effort to monetize content in a media environment dominated by big tech platforms. Some major national outlets have seen more success with this model than their local counterparts. The Boston Globe now maintains a subscriber-supported digital site along with a free portal, and has built a substantial base of digital subscribers with premium online content. Larger organizations with strong brand recognition like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and others have been able to attract millions of paying readers online by offering unique reporting and premium features. Local newspapers have struggled to make subscription models work at scale because their audiences are smaller and the value proposition of paid local news is harder to sell. Digital newspapers are everywhere today. But where are the physical copies? Today, newspapers still exist in both physical and digital forms, but their role and availability have changed dramatically. Print editions continue to be produced by many major and local news organizations, and you can still buy physical newspapers at newsstands, convenience stores, grocery shops, gas stations, and dedicated racks. But they are far less common than they once were. You can also subscribe to a paper for regular home delivery or visit places like libraries, which often keep physical copies on hand for patrols to read free of charge. Despite this, the overall print ecosystem is shrinking, with some major newspapers reducing the number of times they print or stopping completely. If this brought back something you remember, or if your experience has been different, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Do you still read a physical newspaper in the morning? Or do you reach for your phone instead? Is there a paper you've subscribed to for years? Or have you fully switched to digital? If you enjoyed watching, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button and drop us a note in the comments letting us know what you want to see us do next.